Welcome back to EDH on a Budget. I'm your host, Iceman. Today we're going to go over 5 nearly extinct budget cards. By nearly extinct, I mean that they're hardly ever played as the commander. For this episode, I'm using stats from EDH Recast and TCG Player for prices. So first up, we have Nyia Keen. She costs 3 and a green. She's a legendary enchantment creature. She is indestructible, and as long as the devotion of green is less than 5, Nyia isn't a creature. Creatures you cast cost 1 less to cast. And it has an activated ability where you pay 2 and a green, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, you may put it into your hand, otherwise you may put it on the bottom, or into your graveyard actually. Its stats are 5/6. So this is a very good commander. It's very underplayed. Nyia is only in 676 decks according to EDH Rec, and costs $3.40 according to TCG Player. It's in about 0.020% of decks according to EDH Rec, which is really low when you consider the fact that it's a cost reduction on your creature spells. It's an indestructible enchantment. Those are incredibly hard to remove. Enchantments are already naturally more likely to stick around, and then you give it indestructible. Most of the time it's not a creature, which is fine. It means your Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshare won't be exiling it. You specifically need to exile enchantments, which is a lot more difficult. A lot less cards can do that. So one of the best ways to use this is probably in artifact decks. They cost oftentimes no colored mana, it's just colorless mana, so you, with some cost reducers, you could be casting free artifact creatures and it can really storm out. Alright, next card we have Naban, Horde champion, for 2 red. This creature has 5/4 stats. It has trample, and whenever Naban Horde champion deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you may discard any number of cards. If you do, draw that many cards and add that much red mana. Until the end of your turn, you don't lose mana as steps and phases end. So this red card is very unique in that you can basically choose to wheel your hand away if you want when you deal combat damage. There's plenty of ways in red and with equipment to give it double strike. With the trample and 5 power, you're very likely to get through. Chump blockers won't be stopping it because you just have to deal 1 damage to get its effect. And you could really see a lot of your deck if you're digging for an answer or looking for a certain card. The mana it produces is great because it doesn't go away at the end of combat, so you'll have it for your next main phase. This card is in 490 decks, which is 0.014% of decks, and it's only 15 cents. I mean, it's statistically 0.014, so small, it's basically nothing. If you have seen somebody play these decks, comment, let me know. I'm curious how it went. I wouldn't be surprised if those decks did well. These cards are pretty strong. Next one is Perforos Bronze Blooded for 4 and a red. This is a 7/6 legendary enchantment creature, indestructible. As long as your devotion of red is less than 5, Perforos isn't a creature. Other creatures you control have haste. And as an activated ability where you pay 2 and a red, you may put a red creature card or an artifact creature from your hand onto the battlefield, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Now this card I never see, but it is brutal. My friend Mike, he had a Perforos deck and it was just tearing me apart because it is hard to deal with. these indestructible enchantments, they are very likely to stick around, as I said earlier. And this particular just pumps out threat after threat after threat, and it's really hard to deal with because you want to deal with Perforos, but that you also have these massive creatures coming at you because they have haste, and he only had to pay 3 mana to bring it onto the battlefield. So, you know, if he untaps with Perforos on the field, you might be looking at 2 or 3 or 4 big nasty creatures coming your way that you gotta figure out how you're gonna deal with, because they're gonna die at the end step, sure. That doesn't help you if you don't survive past the combat step. And of course this deck was extra nasty because it had cards that could end the turn. So what would happen is the end step trigger, where these creatures would sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step, would go on the stack. And then he would activate something like Sundial the Infinite, which ends the turn. So the triggers on the stack, those sacrifice triggers, they cease to exist. The turn is ended, they get to stick around, and those threats are now permanent. So this card is in more decks, 1,418, which might sound like a lot, but it's still 0.042%. And you can pick this card up for $1.70, which is not bad for a commander. Next, we have Naban, Dean of Iteration for 1 and a blue. This legendary human wizard, it has 2/1 for the stats. If a wizard entering the battlefield under your control causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So basically Panharmonicon for wizards. And I know that sounds limiting, but wizards have a lot of utility for ETBs. They can do anything from drawing cards to tapping stuff down to bouncing stuff, returning instant and sorcery cards to your hand from the graveyard. And Naban is a wizard, so he can trigger stuff too. If you have something that says like a kindred discovery or etc., where whenever wizard enters the battlefield, draw a card or something like that, he can trigger himself when something else triggers from him entering the battlefield. So you could get immediate return on his very cheap, only 2 mana to cast. And if he gets removed a couple of times, it's easy to recast. This is going to be an early play that's going to give you lots of value throughout the game. And I don't think he'll be targeted, just because there's going to be bigger threats on the table, and that is the sweet spot that you want to try for when playing Commander. You don't want to play cards that just get removed, because then the other players that didn't play the removal, they in essence have more cards. They gain more cards. They keep the good stuff, and you're just going down cards. So my personal play preference is to try to stay under the radar with cards and not be the big threat until it is time to win the game. In which case, I would have answers, counters, especially in this deck. Blue's obviously known for that. No, Naban has 826 decks, and that is 0.024% of decks. He's only 35 cents. You should really give it a try. And last is Goreclaw, Terror of Kal Sisma for 3 and a green. It's a legendary creature bear. The power and toughness is 4/3. It has creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. Whenever Goreclaw attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So this is just all good. I mean, casting creatures for 2 less just for having power 4 or greater. I mean, you're gonna put, most of your deck's gonna be power 4 or greater. That's what green does, and being able to cast them for 2 less, that's huge. Like I said, artifact creature spell. I mean, it doesn't have to be artifact creature spells. You're just gonna have creatures that have at least 2 generic mana in the cost, which is not that hard, and you're gonna have big threats if you untap with Goreclaw. And the fact that he gives them all +1/+1 whenever he attacks and trample, you're not even limited to, well, how do I get through? How do I get these creatures trampled? No, you could just throw out big vanilla 10/10s or 8/8s, and with Goreclaw, if he attacks, then they get trampled too, so they're going to get through. I have played a Goreclaw deck, and it was exactly as I'm describing it. It just snowballs out of control so fast. Maybe he doesn't win the next turn because those creatures don't have haste, but this type of deck definitely becomes the threat eventually, where you're eventually just, you need a board wipe to deal with it, because single target removal is not going to be enough to answer all the threats that get dumped onto the battlefield. This card is in 2,869 decks, which is 0.084%. And this card costs 55 cents. And that is it for 5 commander cards that are basically extinct. These are all budget, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like, share, and subscribe button. We are a new channel, and I could have really used the help getting this out there. So thank you for joining in.